And today we're going to be talking about Lotus?
Yeah, first thing I want to start with is, we get time after time after time, when people see the retail price of our Grow, Bloom, and Boost, which is kind of the base of, our simplified nutrient program, they tend to put that up against other Grow, Blooms, and Boosts out there that are much more simplistic in terms of the recipe that those people use. And the thing that we hear over and over and over is, why are your nutrients so expensive? But they're not seeing the whole picture. And again, this is always something that's very hard in marketing to kind of get across the message. And so I figured that this, kind of conversational format was a good way to kind of get this out there, and why it is that actually our nutrients are still a way better deal than 90% of the nutrient companies out there.
Yeah, I think actually it comes out to be less expensive than what you'd find with most recipes.
That's what I'm saying. We're a good deal compared to 90% of the ones out there.
Best value. Value. Well, why don't you start to elaborate on why that's the case?
I was gonna lob it to you, Sheriff.
Okay.
Well, no, I got you. Anyway.
We'll both take it at the same time, or we can finish each other's sandwiches.
That's a good idea. Finish each other's sentences. That should be not very annoying for the crowd. Anyway, let's start with my personal story, because this is kind of where the idea for simplifying the recipe for Lotus came from, which was, back in the day, I used to grow with some very good companies' products. Fox Farm being one of them. I've always liked Fox Farm's products. I think they do a great job. I used to use their Grow Big, their Big Bloom, their Tiger Bloom. And I used to have to supplement with a lot of other nutrient, micro nutrient blends and a bunch of other stuff, seaweed extracts and everything, to get a complete nutrient recipe into my final product, right? Because, just as we were talking with light spectrum in the last episode, there's the macronutrients, but then there's a lot of secondary and micronutrients, and each one of those has a very important role in growing nice, healthy plants, right? So you need that whole micro, secondary, and macronutrient package. And so in order to achieve that, I was having to use probably upwards of 12 bottles in later flowering to achieve what I can get out of a simplistic recipe. Simplistic meaning that it's all in one place. But Lotus has everything that I was using in that 12-part recipe in 3 bottles. And so really that's kind of where the disconnect happens, is when somebody goes into a hydro store and they're buying a recipe that was similar to what I used to use, which I know a lot of people that are in similar shoes, they're going and they're taking a Grow off of the shelf that literally only has a few components. It's got an NPK value to it, and it might have a little bit of calcium in it. It might have a little bit of something else, but it's a very simplistic recipe that you're going to have to add in a lot of the secondary nutrients and a lot of the micronutrients in the back end, right? So you're going to need 1, maybe 2 more bottles just to supplement that one veg to get it to where you want it to be, right? And so with Lotus, that's the problem that we were trying to solve. We were trying to not only take out the inefficiencies of liquid nutrients, which is you're basically hauling around jugs of water, right? And so it's expensive to ship, it's heavy to carry out of the store, can be extremely messy. So that's why we chose to go with the powdered format on our nutrients. But then we also wanted to take all of those, 10, 12 parts and try to jam them into as few bottles as we possibly could, right? And so that's what we essentially did with Lotus Nutrients. And so that's when you're putting value on what you get from Lotus Nutrients versus that 12-part recipe, you really have to take that in mind. You have to look at everything that you're spending money on that 12-part, 10-part, whatever it might be recipe, versus what you get out of the 3 bottles of Grow, Bloom, Boost, maybe adding a little bit of our CalMag if you're growing cocoa or some other medium that requires it. But basically, it's those 3 components that's all you have to buy. There's nothing else behind it.
You don't need to supplement that at all.
Yeah.
And it's going to rival, if not beat, the results that you were getting from your optimized 12-part formula when you were really dialed in.
The quality that I've seen off of Lotus time and time again easily rivals or in most instances beats that 12-part recipe.
Well, you know what? I'll tell you, if it didn't, it wouldn't be on the market, because as you develop products for our company, that, you know, level of what's the word I'm looking? Yeah, that standard. Standard you put on everything that we put out. If it takes longer for us to get something to market, if it's not perfect, you're not going to launch it. And I really respect that and appreciate that as far as our product development is concerned.
Your deputy's got your back.
What's that?
I said your deputy's
got the back. Yeehaw! Shouldn't take the hat off. Expose my pattern. So, do you know what the combined cost was of those 12 parts that you were using at the time?
Gosh, per gallon, I do not know what that was, but I know every time I walked in a hydro store, I was spending $500 minimum to get out of there, right? And the other problem with it was when you start to use all of these different parts, you know, each one of them has their own measurement or their own quantity that they're being added to that water at, right? And so it's really easy to take a recipe like that, which the recipe I was using was handed down from some friends that lived on the Central Coast who we referred to as the Ring of Fire, because their flour that they grew was some of the most amazing flour I've ever seen in my entire life. You know, I mean, it was that bag that you see across the table, and it was like, whoa, what's that? You know, and it was, it was a Romulan strain, and it was just like, it was amazing. I mean, it was some of the best flour I've ever seen in my entire life to this day. And so it was a recipe that was handed down, probably by a few different growers. And if you were to take any one of those components and put either too much or too little in, you now have an imbalance in that recipe. And so as you start to scale up and as you start to push into the higher EC levels, any one of those little imbalances on the low end or the high end is going to start to get out of control as you start to push that EC up.
And if you're making a mistake like that, you most likely don't know where it is, and now you've got all these variables that you've got to troubleshoot. Right. How much time did it take you to administer this recipe?
I mean, it was every time I would walk up to do a reservoir refill and mix all these things, it was always like, ugh. I mean, I had,
this before that, this is in milliliters, this is in grams, and
Yeah, I mean, everything was mostly in milliliters, so it was easy that way because it was all liquid, right?
Yeah.
Well, I guess some of it actually was powder. But yeah, I mean, it's like you're using the big jug to measure some of it. You're using the pint glass to measure some. You're using, the shot glass to measure some, because it all has different potency. You're splashing, nutrients everywhere. The bottles would always have water, the nutrients running down them, which would then calcify. Like, it's a mess. Yeah. It's a mess. All of those bottles would always end up a mess. And because I'm always having to do 10 parts, I would always be mixing different, sometimes I'd do 50 gallons, sometimes I'd do 80, sometimes I'd do 30, right? Depending on what I was doing. And I'd always have to do the math of all these different parts, right? Not just one or two bottles that I'd have to do the math on, but all of these bottles. And so it was a complete pain in the ass. And to be quite honest with you, I even had up on my wall the recipe that I would use, right? This and this and this. And every time I'd leave my grow to one of my friends when I'd go on vacation, it was like, hey, check out the master list of the recipe on the wall and try not to screw it up.
And you get phone calls. Can you translate all this for me?
Yeah, right. And so, so it was overly complicated, right? It's not an impossible thing, but it was overly complicated. And that's one thing that we always wanted to solve.
It wasn't fun. It was a pain in the ass.
Yeah,
every time.
Right, and it's one of the pain points that we wanted to solve with Lotus Nutrients. So when we have people who go in the store and see that our grow is, let's say, 30% more than the competitors grow, what they're really missing in that equation, it's not an apples to apples comparison, right? What they're seeing in our veg bottle or our grow bottle is a complete veg recipe that you could use just completely by itself, all standalone, which is what it's meant for, right? Same thing when you get to flour. We do have a flour and we do have a boost. And those two components hold every single macro, micro, and secondary nutrient that you need to have perfectly healthy growth, super awesome, badass flowers every single time. And so when you're looking at the price comparison of that bottle against another bottle of Bloom that really only contains an NPK and maybe one or two other things, you're gonna have to supplement behind that. So take all 3 or 4 of those bottles, put that cost together, now look back at our Bloom and tell me that it's still expensive, because it's a damn good deal when you look at it in that light.
I mean, it is a difficult thing to market too, right? Because picture somebody comparing 2 starter kits on the web, and you see ours and it comes with 3 bottles, and then you see a competitor's and it comes with 12 bottles, and they're the same price, and you're like, oh, I get 12 bottles with that one, so I only get 3 with that. And so you kind of, it's counterintuitive in that way. It's like more bottles, that's better, but no, it's not. If you can have everything that you need in just those 3, it's actually a much greater value, and it's going to create a much greater growing experience. It's almost comical how easy it is. I have that star at home, and granted, the scale of it is far smaller than anything that you were describing, but it scales in the same way. It's all I do is I have a gallon pitcher. Look at the recipe card. I need a half a tablespoon of that. The measuring spoon is included in the container. Scoop that, mix it up, and I'm pouring, and I'm done. Yeah. And that's all there is to it.
Yeah, and I mean, again, our mission on this podcast is to unite, not divide. But I do have to say, and every grower that's out there knows this by this point, but it's like the nutrient companies have done an amazing job at feeding the false narrative to you that bottle. You need more stuff. You need this, you need that. Oh, now you need this, right? Because I know there's people out there that have more than 12 parts in their recipe. I mean, I know of some nutrient companies that if you look at their product offering, they've literally got 40 or 50 different things. Yeah. And it all is like, oh, this is critical for this, that's critical for this, that's critical for this, right? And it's like they've done a genius job at getting you to buy more and more and more bottles and spend more and more money on their product because they say you need it. I can tell you from experience of 25 plus years of growing that there have only been 2 things in that journey that I started using and was like, holy shit, that made a huge difference. Like that, I can see and tangibly feel the difference on that. Every other product that I've ever added, I'm like, like there might have been some, some effect. It might be a little more crystally, and so it's like there's a lot of it is kind of snake oil to a certain degree, and a lot of it is probably them honestly peeling parts of the recipe out of something that they used to manufacture and adding it into a new bottle that says, oh, you need this now, right? Yeah. Because it's now missing from the recipe on this other bottle.
I mean, I guess in their defense, it is worth saying that it is kind of difficult to get these macro and micro elements to play nicely together, especially in liquid, right? It's not going to be stabilized. The shelf life is going to suffer. And so sometimes you have to separate those things. And then sometimes it's just like, hey, what other additive and other SKU can we add into the portfolio to, to squeeze out some more.
Yeah, and it was honestly, it was one of the biggest challenges at first with Lotus was to get all of that stuff in a bottle and working and stabilized and not, reacting with each other, I mean, some of our, again, we're all about honesty on this podcast. Some of our first formulations, the Bloom turned into a rock. Yeah. It just did, it was like, it was either the calcium that was in there that was, really hydrolyphic and pulling in too much moisture when you'd open the bottle or whatever it is. And so we had to go through a couple formulations before we got it right. Yeah. And now even now we get people that are like, hey, your nutrients are kind of, they look what people describe as like moist, right? Yeah. And it's like, no, it's like that's the way it is. It looks like kinetic sand is how we describe it.
Tons of fun, kinetic sand.
Yeah. Oh,
but don't play with your nutrients.
It's a blast. It's a blast. Sand castles and weird shapes and the way it drips out of your hand and stuff. Yeah,
it's like magic. Much like Lotus.
Yes, right. Yeah. And so that formulation is a very complex formulation, which leads to that consistency, right? But like, guess what? We don't care what, drop your preconceived notions of what a powder nutrient should look like because it's not there for looks. I don't care what it looks like. I care what it does to my plants. Yeah. And if I kid you not, when I say that out of all of the people that have ever tried Lotus Nutrients, the performance of that product has never come up as being something that people are dissatisfied with. Everybody is always blown away with the performance of that product in growing plants, right? All of the complaints that we've ever heard about Lotus Nutrients is from the consistency side of things.
Yeah.
And it's like, who cares about the consistency? Drop your preconceived notions. How did it grow your plants? Oh, it was amazing? That's what we're looking for.
Yeah. Exactly. You're not trying to build a sandcastle with it. You're trying to get the best out of your grow. And if it performs as advertised, then the consistency doesn't matter. But it is all just because of that preconceived notion that people have. Like, there's something wrong with this. It's supposed to be completely
it's like supposed to be talcum
dry.
powder or something.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
But it's not. It's normal, and it's going to kick ass for your growth. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I just want to, make sure that, everybody knows what they're looking at and is able to compare apples to apples. And that goes for all the products in the industry, right? Sometimes you're not looking at apples to apples. The same goes for grow tents, same goes for grow lights. Like, know what you're looking at before you make a judgment call on the price that you're paying versus somebody else's product, because they might not even be in the same league. And we find that a lot, right? I mean, we have premium products. They are more expensive than a lot of our competitors, but you're getting what you pay for.
Yeah.
You're getting quality products that have, balance to them, like Lotus Nutrients, and you're actually ending up paying less for that product than you would for a complete recipe from somebody else, because that we don't have 10 parts to ours.
That's another interesting thing about it too, though, that's deceptive, because that tiny bottle right there will last you a long time. Right? But you're comparing it to a big ass jug, and you're like, oh, this tiny bottle or that big ass jug. But if you break down what you have to feed every time you either change your reservoir or water, you need a fraction of that than what you're going to need from that big bottle.
Yeah, they're highly concentrated.
Yeah,
for sure.
So it lasts longer than the typical comparable bottle sold by other brands.
Yeah.
Yep. So do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between, like synthetic elements versus, the naturally derived?
Yeah,
elements?
sure. Yeah, I mean, this almost kind of came up on, the podcast that I did with Mr. Growit, because he had asked, about organic versus synthetic, And I mean, synthetic is a kind of a bad term that's been put on any fertilizer that is created with fertilizer salts, right? And so a fertilizer salt can come in many forms. Fertilizer salt can literally be a derivative of something that comes straight out of the earth, right? It's just a simple molecule that's pulled out of something that is naturally occurring. And it can be all the way down to something that's pulled out of, say, like a chemical process like petroleum production, right?
Yep.
And so the two of those...
Oftentimes it is.
Yeah. And so the two of those are very different. And then there's also a fully synthesized molecule that is made in a lab, right? And so all of the ingredients that we use in Lotus Nutrients do come from the derivative sources of naturally occurring products in nature, right? Yes, are there industrial processes to extract those and to derive those? Absolutely, right? But that happens with a lot of things. It's not made in a lab, and it surely isn't made by chemical process or industrial process like, petroleum production or any kind of byproduct from something like that.
Right.
And so is Lotus Nutrients organic? No, it's not. Do I prefer growing cannabis, at least with non-organic products? I do. I do. And the reason for that is because they are hyper available for that plant to use.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I came away from that Mr. Growit episode because he admitted to being one of the people that turns down his lights, right?
Yeah.
Which is 100% fine.
Yep.
But he also is on the side of organic growing, which good for him, right? Because organic is super important.
Sure.
And there's a lot of people that prefer to grow that way. And there's a lot of people that would only smoke organic flower, right? But I stepped away from that and I kind of started to think about it, right? So anything that's considered organic is basically the nutrients become available as microbes in the soil break down organic compounds within that soil, right? And so you can only have so many available nutrients at any given time in an organic grow, because you are relying on the microbes to break down that matter and release the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the potash and everything else, right? And there are ways to speed up that process in organic growing. There are ways to increase ppm and all that kind of stuff, but you're not going to get a level of available nutrients that you can get out of fertilizer salts. And so when you think about cranking up that light to 1,000 ppfd, what have we been saying, right? That plant just wants to go. It wants to feed. It wants more and more and more. And so that's hard to keep up with, or harder to keep up with. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's harder to keep up with in an organic setting than it would be by hyper available fertilizer salts.
Yeah.
Right? It's like it's always available. It's always right there. You can control the levels much more accurately with fertilizer salts than you can with organic.
And it's closer to a full-time job with organics, if you're going to push it to that level.
Yeah, and that's not saying that you can't. You absolutely can. You know, and I don't consider myself an expert on organics, and so I don't want to get too deeply into it.
Sure.
Maybe we could get our boy from Build a Soil on
to
talk about that, because he's a master, and
he
he's super dialed.
Yep.
And so that would be a great episode to have, and he could probably school us on that, right? But I think he would also probably agree with some of the points that we're making. If you want to drive your car and redline it like you can with these really high-powered LEDs, you have to have that hyper-available nutrient regimen for that plant, which is why I like to use fertilizer salts, because I'm always looking for as much biomass as I can possibly get of the highest quality that I can possibly get in terms of bag appeal and everything else. And so, really to achieve that, I've always found that fertilizer salts are the way to go. And, that's largely why in commercial facilities you see the same thing, right? Those guys are going for high biomass, high, bag appeal. And so that's why most of them are using fertilizer salts.
Sure. And so, the takeaway is that you can't lump all salts or synthetics into the same category. You have true synthetics made in a lab. You have dirty salts that are derived as like byproduct. And then you have clean salts that are derived from natural sources.
Correct.
And Lotus is all cleanly sourced, naturally derived elements.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dig it.
Yeah.